Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to take an objective look at the profound psychological collision in the Dr. Chen Yuan case. But here's the catch. We're not looking at this through a legal or political lens. Nope. Instead, we're going to use the fascinating, rigorous scientific framework of motivation and emotion psychology. It's going to be a deep dive, so let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with the anatomy of a conflict, look at the scholar's intrinsic drive, and then contrast that with the system's extrinsic fear. After that, we'll see what happens when these motives actually collide, examine the broken causal chain, and wrap up with the psychological verdict.
All right, part one. Anatomy of a conflict, a psychological mistranslation.
So, the very first question we've got to ask ourselves is this. Is this conflict really about factual harm? Or are we actually looking at a complete breakdown in psychological translation between two totally incompatible operating systems? Think about it. On one side, you have an individual scholar. On the other, a massive institutional judicial system. And as our sources suggest, they were basically speaking two entirely different psychological languages.
To really get an impartial grasp on this case, we have to anchor our analysis in motivation and emotion psychology. Essentially, this field looks at the invisible drives and feelings that make people and institutions tick. You can think of motivation as the engine, right? It's the why behind what we do. And emotion, well, that's the dashboard and the fuel. It colors our actions and heavily influences our decisions.
Moving on to part two, the scholar's intrinsic drive, the pursuit of truth and meaning.
Now, have you ever heard of self-determination theory? It's this massive idea in psychology stating that human behavior is deeply driven by three internal needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And our sources showed this maps absolutely perfectly to Dr. Chen. He was on this relentless pursuit of complex knowledge, but he wasn't doing it for a paycheck or a pat on the back. His behavior was purely intrinsically driven by a need for academic freedom and cognitive consistency.
This really shines a light on his actions. When Dr. Chen forwarded academic articles or wrote his massive, complex theoretical defense, he was fueled purely by a desire for the truth. Psychologists called this high epistemic motivation and high autonomy. He just refused to blindly comply. And what's really fascinating is how he handled immense pressure. Instead of breaking down, he used a coping mechanism called intellectualization. He literally converted his extreme stress into a purely logical defense.
To survive that kind of extreme environment, the psychological analysis points out that he used a super mature strategy known as cognitive reappraisal. Basically, instead of letting despair take over, he reframed the whole threatening situation, the incarceration, the trial, into almost like a scientific experiment. He became an observer of his own history, which effectively protected his mental stability.
Just listen to this specific line from his comprehensive written defense. He wrote, "My self-defense is not written for the judge, but for history." Wow. I mean, that is a textbook example of meaning-making. It proves he took all that anger and frustration and transformed it into a transcendent mission. By viewing himself as an observer for the future rather than a victim right now, he completely regulated his emotions and kept his core identity intact.
Okay, let's flip the script. Part 3. The system's extrinsic fear, the pursuit of control and order.
Unlike Dr. Chen's internal drives, the judicial system runs on what we call extrinsic motivations. The sources break this down, showing that the system prioritizes risk avoidance and reducing uncertainty above literally everything else. It's driven by deep institutional anxiety and this intense fear of political accountability. Because of that, it relies heavily on control motivation, using power to forcefully restore order the second it senses any potential disruption.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The sources point out the system was heavily swayed by the affect heuristic. In plain English, that means the institutional anxiety was so deep that decision-makers just bypassed statistical probability entirely. They felt negative emotion, so they immediately judged the situation as a severe risk. Plus, this fear spread like wildfire through the group, a phenomenon called emotional contagion, causing the whole system to adopt a highly defensive, reactive stance.
Take a look at this quote from the prosecution. Upper leadership gave special instructions to make this an ironclad case. This perfectly captures that extrinsic motivation. It highlights how external pressure and this desperate need to just eliminate any uncertainty forced the system to push for a conviction at all costs. The ultimate goal wasn't actually finding the objective truth. It was ensuring institutional safety.
So, what happens when these two forces meet? Part 4. When motives collide, the structural tension.
Let's put their motivations side by side. For Dr. Chen, forwarding an article was just a natural act of research, curating knowledge. but look at it through the system's deeply anxious, risk-avoidant lens. To them, that exact same click of a button was interpreted as the intentional spread of social danger. We're talking about two radically different psychological systems looking at the exact same behavior and seeing completely different things.
The emotional mistranslation is just as striking, honestly. Remember Dr. Chen's calm, intellectualized defense? Well, the system, totally blinded by confirmation bias, misread that entirely. They didn't see his emotional regulation as psychological maturity. No, they interpreted his lack of submission as active hostility, arrogance, and a stubborn refusal to repent.
If we look at this through Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, the divide is crystal clear. As you can see, Dr. Chen was operating on individualizing morals. He valued fairness, care, and liberty. The system, on the other hand, operated almost entirely on binding morals, prioritizing absolute loyalty, authority, and systemic purity. When you have two moral matrices clashing like this, mutual understanding is practically impossible.
Which brings us to part 5, the broken causal chain, testing the psychological links.
Before we even get into the legal mechanics of the charge, we need to ask a really objective question based on emotional psychology. What are the realistic limits of online influence? The system assumed this immense, catastrophic danger, but does the actual science of emotional spread back that up?
Well, the prosecution relied on a very specific 4-step logic to claim the crime of picking quarrels actually occurred. They assumed that 1, the information is forwarded, 2, public emotion is immediately triggered, 3, that emotion drives mass action, and 4, tangible social chaos occurs.
But psychological analysis totally shatters this chain. Why? Because Dr. Chen was what network scientists call an edge node. He had fewer than 100 followers. He simply didn't have the contact density required for actual emotional contagion to happen. And since no real public emotion or chaos was ever actually measured, the sources conclude that the system basically just swapped in its own internal anxiety as proof of public harm.
And finally, part 6, the psychological verdict, lessons for institutional empathy.
To stop breakdowns like this from happening again, the sources emphasize some crucial takeaways. First, institutions desperately need to develop genuine emotional literacy. They need protocols so that raw institutional anxiety doesn't masquerade as rational justice. They also have to learn to recognize high-level cognitive reappraisal, like Dr. Chen's calm logic, and stop punishing it as hostility. At the end of the day, true justice requires understanding human motivation, not just forcing extrinsic compliance.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When a system relies entirely on fear and control to judge a mind that is driven inherently by the pursuit of truth, what is the actual cost to human progress? Thank you for exploring the deep psychology of this fascinating explainer with us.